Line unmuted.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining in. In a conversation with a local government official this week, I was asked what the prospects were for Phase 3. Recall when we did the phased reopening, Phase 3 was to operate without limitations on crowd sizes or events. Sure, to maintain social distancing and vulnerable populations should still take precautions, but from a regulatory standpoint, to be living under largely the same rules as before COVID. More than his desire to move to another phase, what he was expressing was that we all need a goal to work for. We need reasons for hope and optimism, and that things will get better, something larger than what any of us are as individuals. Recognizing that the last 5 months have been difficult on all of us, be it our physical health, our emotional health, or our financial health. I think we get to Phase 3 in one of two ways. One is a vaccine. I was so fortunate last week to spend some time at Inimmune, which is a biotech company in Missoula, as they have Montanans working day and night to be part of that vaccine solution. Even as they're working so hard, though, they acknowledge that a vaccine is still some time away. Until there is a readily available vaccine, the other way we get to phase 3 is to learn to live with this virus in our presence. And learning to live with the virus in our presence, it isn't ignoring or denying or thinking that it'll somehow just magically disappear one day. Learning to live with this virus in our presence isn't disregarding that there have been 80 Montanans that have lost their lives, or 165,000 nationally. And behind every one of those deaths are a grieving family and indeed often a grieving community. Rather, the way that we learn to live with this virus in our presence is living in a way where we recognize and acknowledge that significant risk is present, yet collectively we're acting to mitigate this risk. Clearly, at least collectively, we have not yet learned how to live with the virus in our presence. I think of two recent examples. Example one is Phillips County. In the time span of a week, it went from having 0 active cases to 68. It wasn't from a bunch of different folks bringing the virus in. It was from an adult sports activity, followed by an outing to the bar, and then events afterwards. Those other social events, county fairs, other things where the virus spreads among different social circles. An example, too, where we haven't learned how to live with the virus in our presence is following the requests of public health when it comes to quarantining and isolating. Learning to live with the virus in our presence means respecting that our public health officials, are working damn hard to try to protect all of us. I heard this week of individuals who are told to quarantine because they've been exposed to a positive case, and then just clearly not following that public health direction. A positive Montanan won't infect others if they're in isolation. So I implore all Montanans to learn to live with COVID in our presence until we get a vaccine. That's the only way that we're going to get to phase 3. And it's the only way that our schools will be open and remain open. It's the only way to mitigate the illnesses and indeed the losses of life. And it's the only way that we can continue on a path of economic recovery. We cannot have that economic recovery if we don't have a healthy workforce. And if we don't have confidence among all Montanans that they can visit our businesses. A healthy economy and a healthy workforce go hand in hand. For 5 months of living with this virus, there's no doubt that it has been challenging for Montana's businesses and many sectors of our economy. We continue to focus on getting dollars to the Montanans, small businesses, nonprofits, and farmers and ranchers that need it most. We've now allocated nearly 80% of the CARES Act dollars, with over $210 million in the hands of Montanans. And we're doing so with transparency through a publicly available dashboard. While we focus on making sure that Montanans and Montana businesses can stay on their feet during these challenging times, there's one type of business that's been hit particularly hard because of our collective inability to get to a phase 3. Essentially, every other business type has been able to reopen in some capacity and has seen some portions of their normal revenue at this point, except for the live entertainment industry. Today, we're launching the Live Entertainment Grant Program. This program will be available to Montana-based businesses and nonprofits that are directly engaged in the business of live entertainment and whose revenues primarily come from those live entertainment events. These businesses really are fundamental to the quality of life that we enjoy, and they employ hundreds of workers. But since large groups cannot gather, acts aren't touring, and it isn't smart public health to risk a virus by attending live entertainment events, their revenues have been driven to zero. Entertainment businesses that bring together large groups of Montanans and visitors have had to cancel or postpone events during the pandemic. And while that effort certainly minimized transmission of COVID-19 and kept their customers and their employees safe, it's greatly impacted their revenues and their future outlook. Without additional support for our live entertainment venues, we risk losing those cultural assets permanently. This grant's intended to ensure the long-term viability of live entertainment in Montana. Live Entertainment Grant Program will provide up to 25% of a business's 2019 gross revenue, or a maximum of up to $500,000 per applicant. Programs available to Montana-based businesses and nonprofits in the live entertainment business, and whose revenues primarily must come from those events. Applicants must have derived at least 33% of their 2019 revenue from the sales of tickets for live events. This funding will offer support to the hundreds of workers employed in the live entertainment industry and provide long-term support to businesses to ensure that they can continue to offer events that are fundamental to our quality of life when it's again safe to do so. New today will also be increasing the funding available through the Business Stabilization Grant Program, which has been the most in demand of the dozen grant programs we've set up to support Montanans and businesses. Thus far, the stabilization grants have supported nearly 8,000 small businesses all across our state at a total of nearly $70 million, providing the businesses with up to $10,000 in working capital for things like inventory, rent, and supplies. Like all across the nation, even as our businesses are up and running, though, our small businesses in the U.S. are also, and in Montana, are continuing to face financial implications because of COVID-19. So businesses that have been awarded a grant prior to today will be eligible to receive a second payment for 3 additional months of working capital, equal to that first payment received. So new applicants will be eligible for up to then that additional $10,000 in working capital for a full 6-month period. The state will send email messages to all applicants who had received a business stabilization grant as of August 12, 2020. The same conditions will apply for those applicants to take the money, and then the applicants must either accept or decline that second grant. They'll have until September 2nd to do so. Payments will be dispersed within days of accepting the second grant. And while this only applies to the business stabilization grants, we'll also be looking at another round of the grants for the nonprofits as well. Also next week, we'll be launching the East Edge of Glacier Park Tourism Business Grant. Businesses on the east edge of Glacier have been particularly hard hit with the pandemic due to the closure of that side of the park. With over 3 million visitors to Glacier National Park last year alone, There are businesses on the east side that are entirely dependent upon visitation and that park visitation to keep their operations running throughout the year. And if we want to see the livelihood of these communities during next year's tourism season, they need our help now to sustain their operations. Under this program, tourism-reliant businesses in Babb, St. Mary, East Glacier Corridor may be eligible to apply for a grant up to 25% of their 2019 gross revenue based on a 2019 tax return. Maximum award available is $40,000, and total funding available is set at $2 million at this time. To be eligible, a business must have exhausted the grant opportunities made available through the Business Stabilization or Ag Adaptability grant programs. Now, at the same time that we're getting millions of dollars out the door, Congress did leave town without agreeing on a relief package. By being careful stewards of our CARES Act dollars at the state level, we've been able to be flexible and pick up the tab where the federal government fails to do so. The President this past weekend signed a memorandum to provide lost wage assistance through disaster relief funds. I know that Montanans need this extra support that they deserve during these challenging times, but unfortunately, the federal government once again changed the rules. It will require us to program a new system to get the extra $400 into the pockets of unemployed Montanans. It'll also take the federal government at least 3 weeks on their end to establish grant funding and provide full guidance. But during this time, we'll be working on making the new system happen, and we'll be utilizing CARES Act to provide that full $400 benefit of unemployment insurance additional. Congress also hasn't yet provided funding for schools, so instead of waiting on Washington, we utilize CARES Act dollars to look out for schools at the time that they need it most. We've sent out the door $56 million so far to our schools, and we continue to deliver PPE to schools around the state. Our schools can't afford to wait. We're just now a couple of weeks away from our schools beginning to reopen their doors for at least some partial in-person instruction. Public education shapes who we are and our state's future. And I'm incredibly grateful to our educators and administrators and paras and others across our state who've been working hard over the past several weeks to put safety measures in place to try to curb the spread of COVID-19 and at the same time to provide a quality education. I know that our teachers, administrators, parents, staff, they're going back to school with that extra burden of a global pandemic on top of typical responsibilities of classroom lessons, serving as a mentor in long hours. At the state level, we continue to make available every resource possible to make sure our schools have what they need to be prepared. And with this extra support, our schools can have on hand the supplies that will help make them safe. Our schools are more likely to be successful in keeping the doors open when they engage in social distancing, in the classroom and in the hallways, and when they practice proper hygiene and sanitation protocols. And our schools are more likely to be successful if they require face coverings. A large majority of schools in Montana, as they've been preparing to open, certainly already understand this, and in shaping their plans for reopening, have made it so that masks or face coverings will be required. There's a handful of schools, though, that are still thinking about it, or encouraging, or that have selected not to require masks, however. As we try to take every single possible step to keep our kids and our teachers and staff safe, we have to follow the guidance not just in Montana, but at the federal level. Every week I've been on a call since this started with the Vice President and the Coronavirus Task Force. And every week over the last 7 or 8, they've talked about how you safely stay open, or how you open schools, or reopen schools. And consistently, time and time again, they've said that masks have to be part of that equation. I know that school districts are navigating, and school boards are navigating through unprecedented times with sometimes competing viewpoints. And at the end of the day, we all have that same goal of making sure that our kids can return to school safely. However, for those that are strongly encouraging the wearing of masks or face coverings in our buildings, I do fear that that won't be enough to keep those teachers and students safe. Every other public and government building requires face coverings. And there's no principled reason why the same shouldn't be the case in our schools. As such, I'm amending the July 15 directive on the mask requirement to include public and private K-12 schools in counties with 4 or more active cases. That'll apply to the indoor school spaces as well as to their organized activities outdoors. In addition to preparing our K-12 schools for back to school, and as more Montanans return to work, we're also striving to ensure that there are options to provide high quality and flexible child care during this ongoing emergency. Yesterday, I'd announced that we've directed $50 million to increase child care options for Montana families. The bulk of the funds, at $30 million, will be provided as grants to maintain and expand child care for school-age children during out-of-school time. There's also $10 million available to support families with special circumstances that require in-home care, and $8 million in supplemental payments to all licensed and registered child care facilities to maintain and expand care slots. Again, if we want our schools to open and stay open, and if we want to continue toward economic recovery, we need to strive towards a goal of reaching that phase 3 together. We need Montanans and visitors to follow the guidelines and requirements that we have in place. Our expectations of Montanans remain high, and they remain the same as they have all throughout our response to this virus. Take that personal responsibility to carry a mask with you, and mask up when you go to the grocery store, to grab a beer at the brewery, or participate in a gathering, even if it's outdoors. Be mindful of the most vulnerable around you and be extra cautious in how your behavior may impact those more susceptible to severe illness from this virus. We can and we will return to the time where we'll get to enjoy a concert with friends and families. But that's on all of us, on the actions that we take now and on the actions that we take in the foreseeable future. I'll now open it up for questions. If you'd like to ask a question, you can press 5*. You'll be notified that your hand is raised. When we unmute your phone, you'll be notified that you've been called on to ask your question. If your question's already been answered, feel free to press 5* again, and it will lower your hand. First phone question.
Hi, yes, Governor. This is Casey Elliott at the Dillon Tribune. I wanted to ask you about the boards of health having difficulty with people being told to quarantine or isolate and not doing so. I know that our local board of health is frustrated with it too. Are you going to put out a directive or an enforcement issue? Because I know they've been wrestling with how they actually enforce that and get either tickets or whatever would need to be taken for people that do not obey.
Well, it is when a public health official at the local level directs someone to quarantine, that is a public health order. So that can be enforceable at the local level. So there's not necessarily a directive that I could put out to make people follow local public health. But that's what both, not just the public health officials, but all of local government has to have those public health officers back. Because this is, and you point out, one of the easiest ways to mitigate what is likely possibility for spread. I mean, if you've been in contact with a positive person, you're much more apt, as it would make sense, to get it yourself. This virus is a rapidly spreading virus. So when asked to quarantine, you should quarantine. And especially in a positive case, to isolate, because every one of those that test positive could easily and quickly be the next spreader in a community. So there's not necessarily another directive that I could put out telling local officials and private citizens to follow the orders of the local public health order, but a local public health order is an enforceable order. Next
Hi, Governor Bullock. This is Nikki Willett from Montana Public Radio, Yellowstone Public Radio. Thanks so much for holding this call today. You mentioned that Phillips County is now reporting 68 active cases. The health department there shut down this week as they try to track down contacts and check in on people who are in isolation. What is the state doing to support the county's efforts to contain the outbreak? What kind of resources are you sending out?
Thanks, Nikki. I'm going to turn it over to Jim Murphy, who's the head of the Infectious Disease Bureau.
Great, thank you.
I think the situation in Valley County is one that in Phillips County can be one that is faced in a lot of other areas. They're working closely with the epidemiologists at the State Health Department to address the issue. A couple of things that we're directly doing is they've requested some testing kits be sent their way so that they have room to expand and test more people. We're prioritizing their tests as well, especially close contact investigations. That's a priority where we want to get quick turnaround on those tests. In addition, we have a staff member that is assisting them with contact tracing. They will be doing a lot of the follow-up calls to ensure that those people that were instructed to quarantine are in fact quarantining and monitoring their health to see if we have to do additional testing on those folks. So it's ongoing consultation. So far they have not asked for any resources beyond that, but we check with them daily to make sure that their needs are met. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Next question. Someone's unmuted.
It might still be me. Can I go a second time?
Well, I guess since we left you like that, Nikki, you can.
Well, gee, thanks. I'm wondering what you guys are seeing as kind of the latest trends in terms of 7-day rolling averages and positivity rates. You know, I've been looking at the number of tests conducted over the past couple of days. It's quite a bit lower than at the end of July, and we're still seeing pretty high positive test results returned. So just what can you tell us of kind of the latest trends about how the virus is behaving here?
Yeah, so the testing, I mean, is still up significantly. And if I even look at like what we've done with Mako, that private lab in North Carolina, they've processed over 13,000 tests with about a 2 to 4 day turnaround. Have we put the EPI report up yet? So we just put a new EPI report up on the COVID-19.mt.gov website, Nikki. And I mean, what it shows, look, in the optimistic and positive side of things, that we are going through a time mid-June to mid-July where there was literally exponential growth. Each week, cases were doubling. And now it's linear growth, meaning that by and large, if you look over the last few weeks, we're getting the same number of roughly positive cases. So that suggests, in some respects, that suggests that the actions that Montanans are taking, the masks, the social distancing, the avoiding large crowds, are working. And still, relative to so many other states, we are in a better place. But we're not seeing overall counts going down. And being at a high level, you look at, I think we were at 1,000 cases July 1st. We're north of 5,000 now. We don't have our hands around this yet. So the less growth is great, but the Phillips County is just a perfect example of a county that had 0 and now have 68. And each of us have to take the steps that we can to mitigate the spread of this virus. Next phone question.
Hey, Governor, this is Holly Michaels. How are you doing?
I'm good, Holly. How are you?
Good. I have two questions. I'm wondering, first of all, a little more about testing. If MSU is up and running, and I think you answered a little bit of this in Nikki's answer, but wondering if you have average numbers of how many tests we're sending to the lab, to Mako, and then MSU if they're up and running daily.
So MSU is just starting up and running this week of up to 500 tests. They processed, we had a testing event in Park County and processed 700 total, right? They're in the process of finishing that up. When you look at Mako, as far as the rolling average, I'll go long to you, and then I'll see if Jim wants to add anything more into that along the way. Mako has now surpassed 13,000 tests in the last 3 weeks. And MSU also may have additional equipment by next week, so it could do up to 1,000 a day. And if we were looking at the possibility of pooling for sort of the surveillance tests, which could get it even on a high optimistic end if everything works up to 4,000 tests a day. The point being, at least from my perspective, and we're doing some greater community surveillance testing in Madison County this weekend. We're going to be getting to the point, especially in what I'll call those hotspot counties, those 9 counties, where looking at the potential for much more saturation testing. But it's just getting everything up and running, making sure that Montana State University is going to have the capacity and capability. We know that Mako, that lab, can take up to about 1,000 tests a day for Montana, and our state health lab can run about 1,000 tests.
And then I'm wondering, you talked about last week, and you just talked about now starting the surveillance testing in communities. As we dealt with the backlog at Quest and some of the pauses of those community events, what did it look like for the sentinel testing at nursing homes and congregate care? Did that continue undisturbed, or was that affected too by some of the challenges we were working through?
I think that continued. Go ahead. Holly, I'm just going to have Jim Murphy answer that.
Some of the long-term care centers and some of the assisted living facilities continued to conduct sentinel surveillance, as some responded to outbreaks as well. However, some were in the process of getting us numbers and setting up requisition forms so that we now have all of the ones that want to participate supplied with testing kits and requisition forms to begin their processes. So there were several at different stages, but I think everybody that was looking to participate in this effort has what they need to do so now.
And those weren't going to Quest.
Some of the earlier ones were going to Quest that were some of the surveillance ones. We try to prioritize the ones related to outbreaks and contact investigations and keep those in-house as much as possible to ensure quick turnaround time and still continue that process.
Yeah, I'd only add on that a couple things, Holly. Yeah, early on, certainly, when we were looking at the notion that it'd be 2 to 3 day turnaround with Quest, it did make sense to be sending those with long-term care facilities. And at the federal level, there's been a suggestion or a promise, I guess, that every one of the long-term care facilities in this nation are going to be sent a point-of-care test, a more rapid, sort of like what the Abbott was, but it's a Quidel, though we have not seen many of those yet in Montana.
And then last thing I wanted to ask is, you were talking about the 9 hotspot counties. I'm wondering how things are going there and how asking people to not put in further restrictions, but just follow the ones that are in place, what kind of improvements, if any, you're seeing there?
Well, I think, look, in aggregate, when those 9 counties have 80% of the active cases, or at least they did when we designated them several weeks ago, and we're not seeing the exponential growth, that things are good. Meaning that things will be good when we're in a phase 3 and we don't have to live with this virus, but we're not seeing that continued exponential growth. And we're continuing to work with them about measures that they need to be taking and we can take in concert. Measures like the discussions of schools open in a couple weeks. And the message has to come from not just the state level, but the local level of what needs to be done. And those will be our areas, first and foremost, of most significant prioritization in amping up testing.
Hey, Governor Bullock, this is Freddie Monatis with the Bozeman Chronicle. Thanks for holding this call. I wanted to know, looking at the numbers, the recent numbers, the 7-day rolling average, does it look like the mask mandate is working? And I also wanted to ask, in retrospect, if there are any regrets about not implementing that sooner.
So I certainly hope that the mask requirement is one of the things that will make sure that we curb the spread of this. And look, from the beginning, what I've tried to do is say, let's make sure that this is a public health crisis and an economic crisis along the way. And I think we even, before we put in a mask requirement, there had to be a greater degree of social acceptance. And that's in part what local public health and my team said here. So I was really pleased as business organizations, the state chamber, Tavern Association, others stood up and said, let's just make this part of what we do. You know, I'm hopeful and continue to be hopeful, as opposed to saying, should we have done it earlier? We all say, let's collectively, more than just because there's a state or local requirement, let's collectively do this because we know that it can reduce the spread. So from the perspective of, you know, I'm glad to see where it's working. I know it's not working everywhere, and I think we all have more work to do.
Governor, Jessica Lost with ABC Fox Montana. Just a quick question. Has COVID-19 impacted the state's firefighting fund at all? Or budget?
No, so we have had, and thanks for the question, Jessica. So the question was, if y'all couldn't hear it on the thing, has it impacted the state's fire fund? But it's also a good reminder that Montanans are dealing with more than just the crisis of COVID, that it is fire season. And, you know, an earlier call was from the Dillon Tribune that apparently it was even quite smoky in Dillon today, that I'm also getting the daily reports of what we're seeing on the fires. And just like in some respects with COVID-19, where we all have an individual responsibility to limit the spread, the same is true with fires. So I just ask Montanans, as we're out enjoying our public lands and outdoors, to be as careful as possible. We had already transferred, I think it's north of 55 million to the fire fund, and that was even before the start of this. We've managed our budget, certainly not taking money out of the fire fund. So even today, we have in that fire fund what's about twice the average fire season as far as state expenditures. Last phone question.
Hi, Governor. This is Maritza Giorgio from NBC Montana. Thanks for holding this meeting, and I have two questions for you. The first is, what kind of discussions are happening right now regarding towns like Missoula and Bozeman and their universities, which stand to lose a lot of money because of the recent decisions regarding the football season?
Well, I think, Maritza, we've had plenty of discussions with the university system overall, and I know that it was a difficult decision for the conference and others to say, let's postpone the football season. But one that, as that local government official said, when do we get to phase 3, that they were recognizing that even if you could have a collegiate football season, you probably couldn't have spectators at this point. As far as the revenue losses, both to the university and the respective towns, because you're not packed with thousands of Grizz or Bobcat, there haven't been any discussions to date about that. And that's another one of those challenging ones for sure when you look at sort of the overall economic impact of COVID-19. But we are,
and my second question is,
and I guess I would one more, then I'll let you, Maritza. I mean, another of this is like, look, when we put together the Business Stabilization Grant Program in May to say, how do we help these businesses get some working capital, we're really looking at like a 3-month period. Well, we've now exceeded that 3 months, so that's another of the reason for the 8,000 businesses that got those grants. Many of them are on our main streets all across the state to re-up that grant.
okay, and my second question is, as parents across the state are mulling over what to do when schools go back in 2 weeks, I'm wondering where your comfort level is at, and are you sending your kids back to school?
We are sending our, Lisa and I are sending our kids back to school. And certainly, like many parents, we don't know what all the parameters, you know, I think every parent has closely looked at what the respective districts have put out. Don't know all of the parameters. Had ran into, actually, oddly enough, on the trail this morning, the principal of one of the middle schools here in town, and had a good talk with him about, you know, I asked, how are you doing? Because they are doing what they can to both keep the community safe, and also recognizing, as we said from the start, that this is overall about public health, meaning that it's not just the health of the virus, it's the health of isolation, and making sure that our kids and our communities are healthy. For many parents, I think for the majority of parents, will be to get their children in some in-school instruction at whatever level both that district or the school's comfortable with and that the family's comfortable with. But yeah, my kids are looking forward to getting back into their schools. You good? Fantastic. Again, thank you for joining in, and I'll close where I began, because you know, when the local elected official said to me at the start or as part of a conversation. We're having conversations with all of what I'll say is the 9 hotspot counties. It took me back a little bit at first, like, when are we going to get to phase 3? Because I think, well, all Montanans are fatigued with this. We also know that we're seeing too many cases in our communities. But the more that I thought about what he was saying, and we do have reason for great optimism. I mean, we often focus or talk about, well, here's the latest hotspot, or here's what's occurring, but we never have a discussion about the cases that weren't transmitted. We never have the discussion about the grocery store clerk that hasn't gotten a positive because her patrons are wearing masks. It is truly painful to know that we've lost 80 Montanans to COVID-19. But we don't have enough of the discussions of those lives that were saved by our collective actions. So I do ask, even in a time where, 5 months into this, that we're all fatigued, we wish it would go away. We wish we were in a phase 3. That we maintain that optimism that our collective actions will make a difference. It's the actions that each and every one of us take that'll keep our schools open. It's the actions that each and every one of us take that will make the more vulnerable populations, our legacy Montanans, safer. And it's the actions that each and every one of us take that will lead to, even in this time where things aren't normal, we'll all have a little bit more comfort that collectively we as Montanans have our hands around the spread of this virus and in our deed mitigating it. So thanks for the good work that not just public health does, not just our businesses do, not just our educators do as they look to safely reopen schools, but thanks to the good work that collectively that most Montanans are doing to try to take care of not only their family, but indeed our entire state.
and then retry it and see if that would help?
I'll sure do that.
Okay, I'll keep an eye out for you and get you back in the room.
Okay.
Hi, Representative Welch, it's Sue. It looks like you're back in. Do you want to try your connection again, your audio?
I sure can. Hello, hello. Can you hear me?
Still kind of staticky.
Okay, I don't know. I can change locations. I don't know. Try that and see.
Yeah,
Okay.
that might be helpful.